before the bells of Europe tolled in mourning, before the cities emptied and the whispers of death carried through foggy streets, there was only trade, silk, spices, ivory, and song, moving silently across the great arteries of the East, from China's Yuan dynasty to the ports of the Black Sea, on caravans, on ships, on whispers. The Silk Road, ancient and winding, stretched like a thread through empires. Merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats crisscrossed these routes, linking east and west with a breathless promise of profit and connection. But along those same roads, something else traveled, something far older, far smaller, and far more patient. It began, some say, in the grasslands of Central Asia. There, in the burrows of rodents, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis found its ancient hosts. Tiny fleas, feeding on infected animals, carried the plague within them, unaware that their thirst would soon spark a wildfire. The Mongol Empire, vast and efficient, had created a golden age of global commerce. Their postal relay stations, guarded highways, and port cities were meant to move goods and letters across continents. But they also moved disease. In 1331, Chinese records tell of a strange pestilence, a sickness that blackened skin and claimed entire villages. By the 1340s, the disease had made its way west, following the Silk Road with grim determination. It spread into Karakoram, into Samarkand, into Persia. It moved with traders, with armies, with the wind, and then, like a storm approaching over distant hills, it reached the Crimean port of Kaffa on the Black Sea. There, the Genoese, a powerful Italian trading family, maintained a walled outpost amidst the Mongol lands. In 1346, that city found itself under siege. But this was no ordinary war. The Mongol army, infected with plague, began catapulting the corpses of their dead over the walls. An early and dreadful act of biological warfare. Inside Kaffa, panic. The Genoese fled by sea, heading for Sicily, for Genoa, for Marseille. And with them, they carried death. But in this first part of our story, Europe still slept, still danced, still prayed without knowing what was coming. They did not yet see the dark sails on the horizon, nor smell the bitter smoke of burning homes and mass graves. They still believed their world was stable, divinely ordered, safe. And yet, the wind had already shifted. For the Black Death was not simply a disease. It was a reordering of life, of power, of belief. And its roots lay far from the cobblestone streets of London or the vineyards of France. They lay in Asian mountains, in silken pavilions, in rat-chewed grains unloaded at ancient docks. From the moment the plague stepped aboard those ships in the Crimea, a silent countdown began. In our next chapter, we follow those ships to Italy, to the first trembling coughs, the first blackened fingertips, the first realization that something was deeply, terribly wrong. But for now, breathe deeply. The sea is calm. The lanterns flicker on merchant decks. And in the east, behind the clouds, a shadow moves slowly and will not stop. The sails were white. The wood creaked. And in the hold of every ship, something stirred. It was October 1347 when the first ships arrived in Messina, Sicily. Merchant vessels from Kaffa, fleeing Mongol siege, slipped into the harbor like ghosts. But the people who welcomed them, dockhands, priests, merchants, would never forget what spilled from those ships. Some sailors lay motionless in their hammocks, blackened by fever. Others, barely clinging to life, moaned of boils the size of apples. Their skin bruised dark and oozed from beneath the arms and groin. The city recoiled, and too late, the ships were ordered out. But the sickness had already taken root. From Sicily, the plague bloomed outward, like ink dropped in water, to Genoa, Venice, and Pisa. Then inland, following trade routes, pilgrim paths, and merchant carts. By January 1348, it had reached Marseille and Paris. By June, London. It was as if an invisible hand was drawing a dark spiral over the map of Europe. The symptoms were swift and cruel. First, a strange weariness. Then fever, chills, nausea. And then the buboes, large, painful swellings under the arms, the neck, the groin. Some would rupture, others would not. But nearly all who bore them would die. In some cities, death came within 2 or 3 days. People whispered of the blue sickness, of evil mists, of God's punishment, of witches, comets, Jews, and demons. But the truth remained. No one understood, and no one was safe. Towns emptied. Families locked their doors against one another. Priests refused to give last rites. Gravediggers dropped where they stood. Some fled to the countryside, believing fresh air could protect them. Others stayed in taverns, drinking and singing until the end. And still, the rats crept forward, quiet as ash. In Florence, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio would later write of how fathers abandoned sons, wives their husbands, and one brother fled from another. It was not just a plague of the body, but of trust, of order, of the soul. In Paris, the king fled. In London, Parliament was suspended. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI sat inside a ring of burning candles, hoping the flames would purify the air. Even the most powerful were powerless. And still, the bells rang. For the dead. Every hour. Every day. Churchyards overflowed. Bodies were stacked in pits. Mass graves were marked only with a stone cross, or a prayer whispered by someone too afraid to linger. It was said that in Venice, the gondolas carried more corpses than passengers. In some places, the sick were boarded up inside their homes, walls bricked shut by neighbors hoping to contain the contagion. And yet, life went on. In narrow alleys, vendors still sold their bread. Mothers still hummed to children too small to understand. And artists painted scenes of paradise. Even as the world darkened outside their windows, there were those who believed it would pass, that God would lift the punishment, or that summer heat would kill the plague. But the summer of 1348 brought no mercy, only heat and more flies. In Norwich, in Vienna, in Barcelona, the story was the same. A quiet cough, a fever, and a family left without a name. The plague was no longer a foreign whisper. It was here, in Europe, in the air, in the bones. But even as the continent trembled, beneath the chaos and the grief, something else was changing. A shift in how people saw the world, and how they thought about death and life, and the strange fragility of their cities and crowns. The foundations of old beliefs began to crack, and in those cracks, something unexpected would grow. But first, the continent would suffer. In Part 3, we enter the heart of the darkness, a continent in crisis. Faith tested, society reshaped. But for now, let the streets grow quiet once more, the lanterns dim, and the wind carry you gently onward. By the summer of 1348, Europe was no longer fighting to contain the plague. It was learning how to survive it. Gone were the days of disbelief, when people thought the pestilence might pass them by. Now, the stench of decay hung in every street, and the silence of abandoned towns echoed louder than church bells. Across kingdoms and countryside, the rules that once held society together began to unravel. In Florence, where once the Medici family's coins rang through lively markets, horses wandered freely through empty squares. In Paris, ivy crawled over courthouse doors, and judges vanished like the rest. Cities that had once bustled with chatter now echoed with wind. But even more unsettling than the silence was the madness that followed. There were those who saw the plague not as a disease, but as a punishment. Flagellants began to appear in the towns of Germany, the Netherlands, and France. Barefoot and cloaked in red, They marched through villages in long processions, whipping themselves until their backs ran slick with blood. They sang hymns, sobbed prayers, and begged God for mercy. Some welcomed them, believing that suffering could drive out the plague. Others feared them, as chaos followed their arrival like thunder follows lightning. Order began to collapse. With priests dead, peasants turned to wandering mystics. With barbers and doctors gone, people sought cures in herbs, charms, or strange rituals. In some places, entire communities blamed their neighbors, especially Jews, accused of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg, in Basel, and Mainz, Jewish communities were burned alive or driven out, despite papal declarations pleading for reason. The fear was stronger than faith, stronger than logic, stronger than humanity. And all the while, the plague moved on. It reached the British Isles, the coasts of Scandinavia, and the cold stone cities of Eastern Europe. No region was untouched. Not the castles, not the abbeys, not the forests. Entire monasteries fell silent. Libraries left unguarded. Scrolls turned to dust. And with them, centuries of knowledge drifted into memory. In the countryside, with so many dead, fields lay unplowed, crops withered. Famine followed plague, and the starving turned on one another. Families fractured. Mothers buried sons. Children watched the sick die quietly on straw mats. Some people forgot what joy felt like, but not everyone faded. In the shadows, a shift was occurring. With lords and clergy weakened, peasants found new voice. They demanded better wages, freedom from feudal obligations, land of their own. The social order, so rigid for centuries, began to crack. And art changed. No longer just saints and halos. Now came paintings of skeletons, of dances with death, of peasants and kings entwined in the same grave-bound fate. The danse macabre was born, a haunting image, death as an equalizer. No crown could stop the final breath. No coin could bribe it. And still, some resisted. In small villages, life clung to routine. Fishermen still cast their nets. Mothers still baked bread. A child still laughed when rain pattered on the rooftop. Humanity, bruised and bleeding, did not disappear. It endured. By 1349, the plague had claimed tens of millions. Some say a third of Europe. And yet, the tide began to shift. In some towns, infection rates fell. In others, it surged again, as waves came and went like the sea. But for the first time in years, hope flickered, a fragile candlelight in the wind. And as Europe stepped into the next chapter, its people, changed, scarred, weary, looked around and asked, "What now?" Because after the suffering came the questions. Who would inherit the land? How would faith survive? Could beauty rise again? In Part 4, we enter the age of upheaval and strange beliefs, of revolts, of scapegoats, of shifting power. But for now, let the bells fall silent once more. Let the breeze cool your thoughts. Let sleep drift over a wounded continent and carry you onward. The storm had not passed, but the world had shifted. By the early 1350s, as the Black Death's deadliest waves began to slow, Europe found itself standing amid the rubble of what once was. Villages lay quiet. Fields grew wild. Abbeys stood empty, their bells stilled and their monks gone. But the silence was not peace. It was the breath between grief and change. The old world had cracked. And now, strange ideas, deep questions, and angry voices began to rise from the spaces in between. In England, peasants looked up from the fields and asked, why toil like serfs when so many lords had died? In France, merchants questioned why tithes were owed to churches that could not protect them. In Italy, poets no longer wrote of glory alone, but of death, dust, and the vanity of kings. Everywhere, people were waking up, tender, confused, and changed. The social fabric, once tightly stitched by religion, tradition, and hierarchy, now hung loose in places, and in others, tore completely. Laborers demanded higher wages. Land once ruled by nobles now stood empty, ready for new hands. And the old feudal promises, once enforced by law and fear, began to feel thin and brittle. In 1358, the Jacquerie Revolt erupted in northern France. A furious rebellion of peasants, armed with pitchforks and fury, rising against the nobles they blamed for their suffering. Though it was crushed swiftly and brutally, the message echoed like thunder. The old order no longer felt invincible. In England, the tension simmered until it boiled over in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Led by men like Wat Tyler, the common people marched on London, demanding justice, fair taxes, and freedom. Though betrayed in the end, they too had spoken a truth that could not be silenced. Europe's people were changing, and they would not return to the way things were. But it was not just rebellion that stirred in the wake of the plague. It was belief, or rather, the loss of it. The church, once the bedrock of medieval life, had suffered devastating blows. Priests had died in droves. Last rites had gone unspoken. Pilgrimages had halted. And though some turned even more fervently to faith, many others questioned it. How could a merciful God allow such suffering? Into that spiritual void, new and old ideas crept in. Some blamed the alignment of the stars, believing that Saturn and Jupiter had crossed paths in a way that cursed the earth. Astrology flourished, and star charts became tools for hope and warning alike. Others turned to folk remedies and charms, tying herbs around their necks, burning aromatic woods, or carrying gemstones said to repel sickness. And then there were the flagellants, still roaming from town to town, spreading fear as they spread their blood. More troubling still were the scapegoats. In a world that had no answers, many turned their rage on the innocent. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and conspiring to spread the plague, despite papal orders condemning such lies. Pogroms swept through towns in Germany, Switzerland, and beyond. Synagogues were burned, families slaughtered, entire communities vanished. It was a darkness layered upon darkness, and one that would linger for generations. But even amid superstition, hatred, and unrest, other voices began to whisper something else. Of learning, of reform, of the fragility of power, and the need for renewal. Writers like Petrarch, walking the quiet ruins of Rome, felt the weight of the past pressing against the present. He called it a dark age, and longed for light. In art, skeletons danced with nobles. In literature, death became a character, not a footnote. In philosophy, thinkers began to wonder, not just about heaven, but about the human world and how it might be shaped. Europe was aching, but beneath the scars, it was beginning to stretch, to question, to change. As we drift now to part 5, we will see the final retreats of the plague and the shadows it left behind. But for now, let your thoughts rest. Let the torches dim. Let the winds of change blow soft across the sleeping fields. By the mid-1350s, the terrible tide of the Black Death began to ebb. It did not vanish all at once. It pulled back in waves, softly, cruelly, unpredictably. One village spared, another consumed. One spring free of sorrow, the next soaked in mourning. But still, the change was there, quiet and undeniable. In cities like Venice, Avignon, and London, the air began to smell of wood smoke instead of rot. Chapel bells rang not only for the dead, but once again for weddings and births. Children, once hidden indoors or buried too young, could be heard laughing in alleyways and orchards. Europe was not healed, but was breathing again. The reasons for the plague's retreat were never clear. Did it burn through its victims too quickly? Did survivors develop immunity? Did colder seasons slow the fleas? Or did shifting trade patterns break the chains of infection? No one knew. And in that ignorance, fear lingered. For even as the first wave withdrew, rumors of return haunted every whisper. And rightly so. In 1361, the plague came again. Less deadly, perhaps, but still fearsome. It would return in recurring cycles for centuries, each outbreak smaller but cruel, reminding all that death still lingered just beyond the veil. But those who lived on carried new burdens and strange freedoms. In the countryside, vast fields stood unworked. The labor force had thinned, and those who survived were suddenly valuable. Peasants demanded wages. Serfs walked away from lords who could no longer command them. In some places, laws were passed to freeze wages or forbid migration. But enforcement faltered. Too many had died. Too many now saw the world differently. This wasn't just recovery. It was transformation. Old cities repopulate, but new towns flourish too. The very map of Europe began to shift as trade rerouted and families relocated. Land passed into new hands. Estates fractured. Power, once hoarded by nobles and clerics, began to leak into new spaces. And in the stillness that followed, art and thought were reborn. Painters no longer only drew saints and kings. They painted the real. Farmers, beggars, death, birth, sorrow. From the ashes of the plague rose the early stirrings of the Renaissance. Writers chronicled what they had seen. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, told tales of escape and laughter amid horror. As if to say, even surrounded by death, we can remember what it means to be human. Science, too, took slow, careful steps, though medicine was still rooted in humors and superstition. The sheer scale of the plague forced physicians to observe more deeply. Quarantines were tried, city sanitation debated, hospitals reformed, and as memories of the worst faded, what lingered was the sense that no one was untouchable. The Black Death had cut across every boundary. Rich and poor, pious and sinful, young and old. It taught, in its most brutal way, that mortality is the common thread beneath all crowns and rags. And so, a strange humility entered the European soul, a sense that perhaps the world could fall again at any time. That tomorrow was never guaranteed. Even the architecture changed. Cathedrals stood less proud. Homes were built smaller, closer to ground. Churchyards, once neatly fenced, grew into wild gardens of stone crosses and tangled ivy. People prayed, still, but they also prepared, not just for death, but for what might come after. And indeed, what came after was a different Europe, not yet free from struggle, not yet healed, but different. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the continent stirred toward light, but always quietly beneath the surface. The shadow of the plague remained, in memories, in songs, in paintings, in names carved into forgotten wood. It would be a long time before the world could breathe freely again. But as the clouds parted, a sliver of dawn appeared on the horizon. Let your thoughts rest on that soft horizon now. The hush after chaos, the breath after weeping, the bells had stopped tolling. The smoke from a funeral pyres had faded into the wind. And slowly, quietly, a new Europe began to take shape. But the Black Death had left its mark, deep, strange, and permanent. It had been more than a plague. It was a fracture in time, a turning point, and the world that emerged after it was not the same as the one before. Some wounds were visible: abandoned farms, silent abbeys, the missing faces in every family. Others were less seen, but just as real. People began to think differently. They saw life as more fragile, more fleeting, but perhaps also more precious. In the wake of so much death, there came a longing for meaning and beauty. The Renaissance, that flowering of art, science, and thought, did not come from nothing. It came, in part, from the ashes, from a Europe forced to rethink, to rebuild, to wonder. Painters turned their eyes toward realism. Writers explored the soul with new intensity. Inventors and scholars began to look not just to scripture, but to nature, to mathematics, to the stars. The plague had undermined the authority of old institutions. The Catholic Church, once unquestioned, now found itself scrutinized. How could it explain the death of the innocent? How could it justify its wealth when the poor suffered so deeply? This quiet doubt would, in time, give rise to voices like Martin Luther and the tremors of Reformation that would shake Europe again. The labor shortage, too, changed everything. With so many dead, the survivors had power. Serfs demanded freedom. Craftsmen raised their prices. Women, in some places, took on roles once denied to them, running shops, tending fields, leading homes. For the first time in centuries, the rigid hierarchies of feudal life began to loosen. The very concept of class and privilege would never fully recover. Even medicine, though still primitive, took its first faltering steps toward modernity. Doctors began keeping records, comparing symptoms, observing patterns. Cities started to think in terms of public health, building sewers, controlling trade, creating quarantine zones. The word quarantine itself, derived from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, was born during this time, as ships were held in harbor to stop the spread of disease. The Black Death had shown that sickness did not respect borders, and slowly, the idea took root that governments had a role to play in protecting their people's health. Culturally, the trauma echoed for centuries. Dances of death appeared in murals and manuscripts, skeletons leading kings and beggars alike in a grim procession. These images were not just morbid. They were reminders that life was temporary, that pride was hollow, that we are all, in the end, the same. But there was also resilience. Folk tales began to reflect survival, wit, and endurance. Songs, though mournful, held notes of hope. And in the darkest nights, people still lit candles, still told stories, still looked up at the stars. Even today, the Black Death whispers through history. Its bacteria, Yersinia pestis, has been mapped by modern science. We understand it now, how it moved, how it killed, how it might be stopped. But understanding does not erase memory. The mass graves uncovered across Europe speak to us still, not of despair, but of the scale of endurance. For despite it all, humanity endured. We adapted. We mourned. We grew. The story of the Black Death is not just about death. It is about how we respond to it, how we make meaning in the face of loss, how we reshape the world after it breaks. And as you lie back now, letting your thoughts drift like leaves on a soft stream, remember this. Even in history's darkest chapters, there is always a next page, always another morning, always the quiet breath of hope beneath the silence. Let this final thought carry you gently into rest. The world fell, the world changed, and the world rose again. Good night.